It was a crisp autumn morning when the city's streets began to stir with the rhythm of a new day. Office workers hurried along sidewalks, their coffee cups steaming in the cool air, while cars humped impatiently at crowded intersections. Amid the bustling chaos of downtown, a figure shuffled unnoticed, blending into the backdrop of the urban scenery. Dressed in tattered clothes with a threadbare coat hanging loosely over his shoulders, he carried a battered backpack slung over one arm. His face, shadowed by an unkempt beard, bore a weary expression as if he'd seen more than his share of life's struggles. What no one realized, however, was that this man wasn't who he seemed to be. Beneath the layers of grime and frayed fabric lay a secret that would shock everyone. Richard Caldwell, the city's most elusive billionaire, had chosen to disappear from his opulent life for a single day. A man known for his sprawling mansions, private jets, and a reputation as one of the shrewdest investors in the country, Richard had everything money could buy. Yet that morning he had traded his tailored suits and polished shoes for something far simpler, stepping into the shoes of the unseen, the overlooked, the forgotten. This wasn't an impulsive decision. For months, Richard had grown increasingly uneasy with the whispers he'd heard about his own bank, a towering institution that had stood as a symbol of security and trust for decades. It was a bank he had built from the ground up, pouring not just his wealth, but his name into it. But now, rumors swirled that the very people who needed it most were being turned away. The idea haunted him. Could it be true? Could his own creation have lost its way? Determined to uncover the truth, Richard devised a plan as unconventional as the man himself. If he were to understand the reality of how his bank treated its most vulnerable customers, he needed to experience it firsthand. Not as the billionaire owner whose calls opened every door, but as someone with nothing to their name. He wanted to test the bank's integrity, to see whether its polished image was just a facade for greed, or whether its employees truly stood by the principles he once held dear. The disguise was simple but effective. His personal stylist had grumbled at the idea of deliberately ruining a perfectly good set of clothes, but Richard had insisted. The beard, courtesy of a skilled makeup artist who had worked wonders with prosthetics. Even his closest friends would have walked past him without a second glance. He looked every inch the part of the man who had hit rock bottom. With his heart pounding, Richard approached the glass doors of the main branch. It was an imposing structure, all sleek lines and modern architecture. Its very design meant to inspire trust. Inside, the atmosphere was equally polished. Floors gleamed under the bright lights, and the scent of freshly brewed coffee wafted from a small cafe near the entrance. But Richard wasn't here to admire the decor. As he stepped in, the contrast between his shabby appearance and the bank's opulence became strikingly clear. The first test came almost immediately. A security guard at the door hesitated as Richard walked in, his gaze lingering on the man's disheveled figure. For a moment, it seemed he might intervene, but instead he sighed and looked away, as though deciding it wasn't worth the effort. Richard felt a flicker of relief, but also a pang of disappointment. Had he been allowed to pass simply because he wasn't causing trouble, or was it because the guard didn't see him as worth engaging with? The real challenge lay ahead, and Richard knew it. His goal was to speak to a loan officer, presenting himself as a man in desperate need of help, a man on the brink of losing everything. He had crafted his story carefully, making sure it mirrored the experiences of countless people he'd read about in letters to the bank. A series of unfortunate events, a failed small business, mounting debts, and now, one last plea for a lifeline. He approached a front desk, where a young woman was typing away on a computer. Her name tag read Emily, and her warm smile didn't waver as he approached. "Good morning, sir. How can I help you today?" she asked, her tone professional but kind. Richard cleared his throat, his voice roughened to match his appearance. "I need to speak to someone about a loan," he said, lowering his gaze as if ashamed. Emily's smile faltered just for a second before she quickly recovered. "Of course," she said, her hands pausing over the keyboard. "May I ask what kind of loan you're looking for?" "It's for personal reasons," Richard mumbled, clutching the strap of his backpack tightly. "I don't have much, but I need to try." I'm at the end of my rope. For a brief moment, Emily hesitated, glancing at the line forming behind him. Richard could see the internal debate playing out in her eyes. Should she prioritize efficiency, moving on to the next neatly dressed customer, or take the time to listen to a man who might not even qualify? Finally, she nodded and said, "Let me find someone who can assist you. Please take a seat over there." She gestured toward a waiting area with plush chairs that seemed completely out of place for someone like him. As Richard sat down, he couldn't help but notice the curious glances from other customers. Some avoided looking at him altogether, while others whispered to each other. He ignored them, focusing instead on the upcoming conversation. Would the loan officer treat him with dignity, or would they dismiss him outright? When a middle-aged man in a tailored suit finally approached, clipboard in hand, Richard stood to greet him. The man's expression was unreadable, his practiced smile giving nothing away. "Good morning, sir," he said smoothly. "I understand you're here to discuss a loan. Why don't we step into my office?" And so began a meeting that would not only test the integrity of the bank, but also reveal the true character of the people who worked within its walls. What Richard didn't realize, however, was that the day would hold surprises he hadn't planned for, surprises that would force him to confront not just the flaws in his institution, but the assumptions he'd carried with him his entire life. As the door to the office closed behind him, Richard felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had prepared for many outcomes, but nothing could have readied him for what was about to unfold. Richard followed the loan officer to the small, glass-walled office. It was immaculate, as though no one ever truly lived or worked in it. A sleek desk sat at the center, flanked by minimalist chairs, and the faint scent of lemon polish hung in the air. The man gestured for Richard to sit, his polite smile remaining firmly in place as he took a seat opposite him. "Thank you for taking the time to meet with me," Richard began, his voice quiet and wavering, as though he were unused to speaking in such environments. It wasn't far from the truth. It had been years, decades even, since he'd needed to sit in a chair like this, asking for help. "Of course," the man said, folding his hands neatly on the desk. His name tag identified him as Carl, and he exuded the practiced confidence of someone who had delivered bad news enough times to make it sound almost pleasant. "Before we begin, may I have your name?" Richard hesitated, pretending to be caught off guard. It's James Morgan." Carl nodded, scribbling the name on his clipboard. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Morgan. Let's start with a few basics. Can you tell me what brings you here today?" Richard shifted in his seat, clutching his battered backpack tightly against his chest. His voice was hoarse, almost cracking. "I have hit a rough patch. Lost my business a few months ago. It was a small repair shop. Nothing fancy, but it paid the bills. Then the landlord raised the rent, and I couldn't keep up. Everything spiraled after that." He looked down, as though ashamed to meet Carl's eyes. "Now I'm just trying to find a way to get back on my feet." Carl listened, his expression carefully neutral. He nodded at appropriate intervals, making small notes on his clipboard. Richard wondered what he was writing. Did he believe him? Or was he mentally preparing the polite rejection he seemed so adept at delivering? "What kind of loan are you looking for?" Carl asked, his tone smooth but detached. "Just enough to rent a place," Richard replied. "Maybe get some tools so I can start taking jobs again. I don't need much. $5,000 maybe." Carl's pen paused mid-scribble, and he danced up. 5,000, he repeated, as if testing how the words felt coming out of his mouth. "And do you have any collateral? Assets, savings, anything that might secure the loan?" Richard shook his head, letting out a nervous laugh. "If I did, I wouldn't be here." Carl's polite smile faltered for just a moment before returning. "I see," he said, his pen resuming its movement. "And your credit history? Do you have any outstanding debts?" Richard hesitated again, as though searching for the right words. "I don't know," he admitted. "I haven't checked in a long time. Probably not great, if I'm being honest." Carl leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. His expression hadn't turned unkind, but it had hardened slightly, becoming more analytical. "Mr. Morgan, I appreciate your honesty, but I want to set realistic expectations. Banks typically require a strong credit history and some form of collateral for personal loans, especially for amounts like this." "I understand," Richard said quickly, "but there must be something you can do. I'm willing to work hard. I just need a chance." Carl didn't respond immediately. He tapped his pen against the clipboard, staring at Richard as though trying to size him up. For a moment, the silence in the room felt suffocating. Richard could almost hear the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead. "I'll need to check with my supervisor," Carl said finally. "We do have some programs for individuals in financial hardship, but they're very case-specific. I can't promise anything, but I'll see what's possible." Richard nodded, a flicker of relief crossing his face. "Thank you. I really appreciate it." Carl stood, gathering his clipboard. "Wait here," he said, his tone now brisk and professional. As he left the room, Richard watched him go, his mind racing. Was Carl genuinely trying to help? Or was this just a polite way of delaying an inevitable rejection? Alone in the office, Richard took a deep breath and let his shoulders slump. The weight of the act was heavier than he'd expected. He wasn't used to being seen as weak or powerless. In his world, he commanded respect with a single glance or a word. Yet here, he was just another struggling man, easy to overlook, easy to dismiss. As he sat waiting, his gaze drifted to the window. Outside, he could see the busy floor of the bank, employees moving briskly between desks, customers lined up at the counters. It was a well-oiled machine designed to keep things running smoothly. But how many people like him, people who didn't fit neatly into the system, were being quietly pushed aside? The door opened, snapping Richard out of his thoughts. Carl returned, his expression unreadable. He sat down, placing the clipboard on the desk with deliberate care. "Well?" Richard asked, his voice tinged with a mixture of hope and apprehension. "I spoke with my supervisor," Carl began, his tone measured. "We have a program that might be a fit for your situation. It's specifically for individuals who are trying to rebuild after financial setbacks. However," he paused, glancing at the clipboard, "there are some strict requirements. You'll need to provide proof of income, or at least proof of potential income. Without that, the application can't move forward." Richard frowned, his brow furrowing. "Proof of income. But I told you, I lost my job. That's why I need the loan." "I understand," Carl said, his voice remaining calm. "But the bank needs to see some evidence that you'll be able to repay the loan. It's standard policy." Richard leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. "So what you're saying is, if I already had money, you'd give me more money. But because I don't, I'm out of luck." Carl hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "It's not that simple," he said carefully. "The bank has to mitigate risk. If we gave loans to everyone who asked, without any safeguards, we wouldn't be able to stay in business." Richard leaned back, letting out a bitter laugh. "Right, of course. Business." For a moment, neither man spoke. The air in the room felt heavy, the polite facade between them starting to crack. "Mr. Morgan," Carl said finally, his voice softening. "I understand this isn't the answer you were hoping for. But there are other options. Community programs, charities, there might be resources available to help you." Richard stood abruptly, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. "Thanks for your time," he said curtly, his voice tinged with anger and disappointment. As he walked out of the office, his mind was racing. The encounter had confirmed his worst fears. His bank, the institution he had built to help people, was failing them. He felt a mix of frustration and shame, not just at the system, but at himself. How had he let it come to this? Stepping outside into the crisp autumn air, Richard paused on the sidewalk. The city buzzed around him, oblivious to the weight of his thoughts. He glanced back at the imposing building, its glass facade gleaming in the sunlight. For the first time in years, he felt like an outsider looking in. But this wasn't over. If anything today had only strengthened his resolve. He had seen enough to know that something needed to change. And if the people inside that building wouldn't do it, then he would. As Richard walked down the bustling city street, his mind swirled with conflicting emotions. He had always believed in his institution, in the vision he had set for the bank when it was just an ambitious idea sketched on paper. It wasn't meant to be a cold machine, operating purely on numbers and policies. It was supposed to be a bridge for people in need, a place where hard work and integrity could meet opportunity. Yet, what he had just experienced painted a very different picture. The sunlight bounced off the skyscrapers, blinding him momentarily. Richard adjusted the strap of his backpack and stopped at the corner, watching as people hurried past. A few were engrossed in their phones, some carrying briefcases, while others looked as if they were carrying invisible burdens, heads down, shoulders slumped. For a brief moment, he wondered how many of them had been in his shoes, desperate for a break but unable to find one. He noticed a man in a navy suit standing a few feet away, talking loudly into his phone. From his tone, he seemed to be negotiating something big. His polished demeanor and commanding voice reminded Richard of himself years ago, back when every call held the promise of a new deal. Richard turned away, almost ashamed of the comparison. That version of him felt like a stranger now. As he crossed the street, he spotted a small park, tucked between two towering office buildings. It wasn't much, just a few benches and a patch of grass, but it offered a reprieve from the chaos around him. He made his way to a bench near the edge, dropping his bag beside him and leaning back with a heavy sigh. While the noise of the city hummed in the background, his mind began to piece together what he had learned so far. Carl, the lone officer, wasn't necessarily a bad person. He had followed the rules, adhered to the policies. But that was the problem. The rules themselves seemed designed to shut people out. It wasn't about helping. It was about minimizing risk. Somewhere along the way, the bank had lost its soul. Richard's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of laughter. He glanced to his left and saw a young girl playing with a scruffy dog while her mother watched from a nearby bench. The scene was simple, ordinary, yet it tugged at something deep inside him. He couldn't pinpoint why, but it reminded him of his childhood, of simpler times when money wasn't the measure of everything. Back then, kindness and community meant something. The mother caught his gaze and offered a polite smile. Embarrassed, Richard quickly looked away, his eyes falling on his tattered backpack. The juxtaposition was stark. His disheveled appearance against the pristine suits and dresses that surrounded him. He was no longer invisible, but he wasn't seen either, not truly. His thoughts were interrupted again, this time by the sound of his phone vibrating inside the bag. He pulled it out, careful to keep the screen shielded from view. Though he had swapped his Seek smartphone for an older, cracked model to complete his disguise, the phone still carried his connections. The name on the screen made his heart skip a beat. Margaret Sanders Margaret was his trusted assistant, the one person in his company who knew about his experiment. He answered quickly, keeping his voice low. Yes. Her tone was a mixture of urgency and frustration. Mr. Hart, are you okay? You were supposed to check in hours ago. The board meeting is tomorrow, and there are questions about your absence. I'm fine, Richard said, glancing around to ensure no one was listening. And I'll be there for the meeting. Just keep things steady for now. There was a pause on the other end. I assume your little experiment isn't going as planned. Richard hesitated. He trusted Margaret, but even she couldn't fully grasp what he was trying to achieve. It's revealing a lot, he said finally, but I need more time. Time's exactly what we don't have, she replied sharply. If the board catches wind of this, they'll think you've lost your mind. You built this company, Richard. Don't let them take it from you. I won't, he said firmly, but this is bigger than the board. I need to understand what's really happening on the ground. Margaret sighed, her frustration palpable. Fine, but be careful. You're walking a fine line, and not everyone is going to play by your rules. The call ended, leaving Richard feeling more unsettled than before. She was right. He was walking a fine line. If the board discovered his disguise, it could spark a storm he wasn't ready to weather. but backing down wasn't an option. Not now. As the day wore on, Richard wandered through the city, his observations becoming sharper with every step. He passed by a soup kitchen and saw a line stretching around the block, men and women of all ages, their faces etched with fatigue and quiet desperation. Further down the street, he noticed a man in a threadbare jacket holding a cardboard sign that read, "Asterisk will work for food asterisk." Richard approached him cautiously, pulling a few bills from his pocket. The man's eyes lit up as Richard handed him the money, but instead of walking away, Richard asked, "How long have you been out here?" The man looked surprised at the question. "Couple months," he said. "Lost my job when the factory shut down. Been trying to find work, but it's tough." Richard nodded, his chest tightening. "Have you tried the banks? Loans, programs, anything like that?" The man chuckled bitterly. "Yeah, right. Banks don't care about people like me. They see this," he gestured to his worn clothes, "and they write you off before you even get through the door." Richard thanked him and walked away, the man's words ringing in his ears. It was the same story, over and over. The system wasn't built to help. It was built to exclude. As dusk fell, Richard found himself back at the bank, standing across the street and staring up at its towering facade. The building seemed almost alive, its glass walls reflecting the fading sunlight like a giant impenetrable barrier. Inside, the employees were likely wrapping up their day, checking their watches and thinking about dinner plans. None of them would spare a second thought for the people they had turned away. Richard's jaw tightened. He had seen enough. It was time to take things to the next level. He didn't have all the answers yet, but one thing was clear. The system needed to change, and if no one else was willing to do it, he would. As night fell, the city transformed. The bright, bustling streets gave way to dimly lit corners and quieter shadows. Richard lingered near the bank, blending into the background as the last few employees filed out of the building. He watched them, their expressions wary but content, their expensive coats and briefcases symbols of a comfortable life he had once taken for granted. He wondered how many of them understood the weight of their actions, the ripple effect of every denied loan, every dismissed plea for help. A sharp gust of wind reminded him of the chill in the air. Pulling his threadbare coat tighter around himself, Richard crossed the street and approached the bank. The building loomed over him, its glass facade cold and unyielding. It felt like standing before a fortress, one built not to protect but to exclude. He stepped into the vestibule, where the ATM and night deposit box were the only signs of life. For a moment, he simply stood there, staring at the insignia of the bank etched into the glass doors. It was his insignia, his vision, or at least it had been. The sound of a car engine snapped him out of his thoughts. He turned to see a sleek black sedan pulling into the employee parking lot. Richard's heart quickened. The car was unmistakable. It belonged to Daniel Graves, the bank's regional manager and one of the most powerful figures in the institution. Daniel wasn't supposed to be here this late, but the timing felt too perfect to be a coincidence. Richard moved quickly, positioning himself near the entrance but out of sight. He watched as Daniel stepped out of the car, his tailored suit and polished demeanor, a stark contrast to Richard's current appearance. Daniel's expression was unreadable, but his body language suggested urgency. He glanced around briefly before entering the bank through a side door, one accessible only with a keycard. This was it. Richard's pulse raced as he made his way around the building, searching for a better vantage point. He'd found a narrow alleyway with a clear view of the windows on the ground floor. The lights inside were dim, but he could make out Daniel moving through the office, his silhouette casting long shadows on the walls. Richard's mind raced. Why was Daniel here? Was it a routine check, or was there something more going on? His gut told him it was the latter. Daniel wasn't the type to put in extra hours without a very good reason. From his spot in the alley, Richard noticed another figure inside the building. This one was harder to make out, but it appeared to be a woman. She was standing near Daniel, her posture tense, her hands gesturing as though she was explaining something. Richard squinted, trying to get a better look. The woman wasn't dressed like an employee. Her attire was too casual, too out of place for a corporate environment. The conversation between the two seemed heated. Daniel paced back and forth, his movements sharp and agitated. The woman stood her ground, her arms crossed in defiance. Richard couldn't hear their voices, but the tension between them was palpable even from a distance. His curiosity burned hotter with each passing second. Who was this woman, and why was she meeting with Daniel after hours? Was she a client, a whistleblower, or something else entirely? Richard's mind spun with possibilities, each more troubling than the last. He shifted slightly to get a better view, his foot accidentally kicking a loose piece of gravel. The sound was faint, but enough to make him freeze. He held his breath, his heart pounding as he waited to see if anyone had heard. Inside, Daniel's movements didn't falter. The conversation continued uninterrupted, and Richard exhaled in relief. Suddenly, Daniel stormed away from the woman, heading deeper into the office. The woman stayed where she was, her arms dropping to her sides as though she had just lost an argument. She glanced around the room, her expression a mix of frustration and fear. Then, to Richard's surprise, she pulled out her phone and began typing furiously. Richard's instincts kicked in. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't normal bank business. He had to know more. He edged closer to the building, searching for a way to eavesdrop without being noticed. His eyes landed on a ventilation grate near the base of the wall. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. He crouched down, positioning himself near the grate and straining to catch any sound from inside. At first, all he could hear was the faint hum of the building's HVAC system. But then, voices began to filter through, muffled but distinct. "You don't understand what's at stake," Daniel's voice said, his tone sharp and authoritative. "If this gets out, it's not just my job on the line. It's the entire operation." "I'm not trying to ruin anyone," the woman replied, her voice quieter but filled with determination. "But people deserve to know the truth. This isn't right." Richard's brow furrowed. What truth? What operation? His mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of the conversation. "You think the world cares about your moral high ground?" Daniel shot back. "They care about results. And if you so much as breathe a word of this, I'll make sure you regret it." There was a pause, heavy and suffocating. Richard leaned in closer, his heart pounding in anticipation. "I'm not afraid of you," the woman said finally, her voice steady despite the threat. "But I won't let innocent people pay the price for your greed." Daniel laughed, a cold, hollow sound that sent chills down Richard's spine. "Innocent? Don't kid yourself. No one's innocent in this game." Before Richard could process the chilling exchange, he heard footsteps approaching. He scrambled back into the shadows, his pulse racing as the side door opened. The woman emerged, her face partially illuminated by the streetlights. She looked over her shoulder once before hurrying down the street, disappearing into the night. Richard remained frozen, his mind reeling. Whatever was happening inside that bank, it was bigger than he had imagined. The integrity he had hoped to test wasn't just flawed, it was potentially non-existent. And now he was more determined than ever to uncover the truth, no matter the cost.